I work as a security guard for a company that takes jobs no one else will. I've been a security guard in my company for over 2 years now, but the work my company does is not your typical run-of-the-mill. To put it simply, my company accepts jobs which no other security company will. That includes high-risk assignments, which often results in deaths of the staff members or abandoning of their posts. Let me take it from the top. When I started working here, they had a very long one-on-one with me to explain all the potential dangers I would be facing. They also made me sign an NDA and a bunch of other papers which stated that if something were to happen to me, the company would not be held responsible. They explained that the job is risky, but also paid well. I had been jobless for a while and jumped at the opportunity, regardless of the risks. Unlike most other companies though, they made me read through the entire NDA aloud and made sure I was aware of all the rules. Some of the things I read there made me think initially that this was all a joke, but then I saw that my superior was dead serious. My job would basically be to provide support to the guards at other posts via comms and patrol the perimeter I was stationed at. Now our HQ was located in an office building compound which had multiple companies renting the adjacent buildings. I would mostly work nights with the occasional mornings. The rules were as follows. I was to do a full sweep of the compound in all offices, save for Building 4, the call center office. I was not to approach Building 4 under any circumstances, no matter what I heard from the outside. Even if I saw someone inside from the windows, I was not to engage. When I asked for more details, they refused to answer me, stating that I should simply obey their orders if I value my life. Now, people have a normal 9-to-5 job in that building, and nothing seems to be wrong during the day. When I do ask the employees about it during my morning shifts though, they all seem to either not know anything or abruptly find an excuse to end the conversation. For Building 6, the designer company, the rules were even stranger. Here's what the chief told me. In Building 6, you may sometimes run into someone, a woman to be precise. She's going to try to start a conversation with you. It is imperative that you ignore her presence at all costs. She will try to talk to you, taunt you, but she will never get in your way. An extremely important rule to remember, and I cannot stress this enough, is that if you see her in the building, don't run or exit the building before finishing your sweep. Trust me, she'll know. Do the sweep as you normally would. Check every room and then quietly exit, ignoring her all the way. She will become increasingly agitated and violent, might even try to startle you, tell you there's something behind you in a very convincing manner. Just ignore her. If you don't, well, you don't want to know what happened to the last guard. I've since encountered the woman once, and it was a grueling and agonizing experience I would rather not talk about. Another rule I had to remember was not opening the gate between the hours of 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. The chief said that under no circumstances am I to open the gate, even if the next guard comes 5 minutes earlier to relieve me of duty. The gate has to remain closed. That brings me to the experience I had once. It was about 6 months after I started working and the sun was almost already up. I heard knocking on the gate, and when I went out, I saw through the gate the silhouette of my coworker. "Hey, mind opening the gate?" he asked. As I approached and put my keys into the keyhole, my phone started ringing. I answered it without even looking at the caller, but when I heard the voice, my blood froze. It was my coworker. "Hey, I'm gonna be late, 30 minutes today. Sorry, man." I hung up and just realized it was 6:50 a.m. I stared at the silhouette on the other side of the gate, who suddenly started banging on the door, demanding to be let in, stating he had lost his cell phone and he was the real coworker. I retreated to the guardhouse and waited for what seemed like forever until the banging stopped. In reality, it only lasted until 7 a.m. Those were all the rules I had to follow on my own post, and most of the time it's uneventful. However, I've heard stories from other coworkers. Since I'm in contact with guards at other posts, one of them told me this story. He worked as a guard in a residential building, and one night an old man who lived there called him to come to his apartment. He didn't explain what was wrong, just told him to go there, so he did. When he reached the apartment, the wife of the old man was crying, stating that her husband was dead. The guard tried convincing her that her man was very much alive and had, in fact, brought him there. But then he turned around. The old man was gone. It was then that he saw the old man's dead body in his chair, near his sobbing wife. He quit the same night. Another creepy thing that happened was on a farmstead which our company has guards posted on. A guy by the name of Jeff who worked there told me about his own experience, which made him run away from his post in the middle of the night. So apparently, the farm was empty at that time since it needed some stuff built first. But his duty was to basically patrol circles around the farm and make sure there were no squatters or vandals. So one night, as he's walking around, he hears someone calling his name in a playful tone. He dismisses it as his imagination at first, but when it reoccurs, he asks who's there and demands they show up with their hands in the air. Now I haven't seen this, so I can't guarantee anything, but Jeff swears it's true. He says all of a sudden, out of the crops, a man just stands up. The top of the crops reaches to his waist, which was technically impossible, because the crops themselves were taller than Jeff, and he's a pretty tall guy. But the man grins at Jeff and continues calling his name playfully, as if he's still hiding from him. Needless to say, Jeff didn't stick around to see what the fuck that guy wanted. When he reported it to HQ, they said there were sightings of that man in the past, always calling the names of the guards, but never really doing anything harmful. The final thing I'll share with you here is my experience when I was stationed at a hospital for 1 month. It was a private clinic of some sorts, and my job was to basically monitor the camera feed. Camera 3 was off though, and when I asked why, they told me to keep it that way and never turn it on. They also said that from time to time, I may see a person on the feed which covered the outside of the security office, and that he would just be standing there, facing the door. I was to remain in my office when that happened, and not glance at the door. He would usually disappear after 30 minutes or so. Patrolling was strictly forbidden between the hours of 3 AM and 6 AM. Money is one of the reasons why I haven't quit so far, and the dangers aren't that bad once you get used to them, and you know what you're doing. And plus, getting stationed at different posts keeps the job adventurous and dynamic. If you lack any special talents or qualifications like me, this job is perfect for you. So, a lot of you were asking to hear more about my job and the duties that come along with it. I'll be sharing in this post more about the stories I have and what I heard from the other guards. I know you particularly wanted to know about the woman in Building 6, so I'll be sharing my experience with that first. This happened about a year ago, but I still dread going back to the building every time during my patrol. I was doing a sweep of the building, using my flashlight to illuminate my path. As I was done checking one of the offices, as I turned around, my heart nearly popped out of my chest at what the beam of my flashlight landed on. It was a woman in her late 20s with unkempt hair and raggedy clothes. She was just standing there staring at me, not even flinching at the light in her face. I was about to talk to her, thinking she was a squatter, completely forgetting about the rules, since I had never once encountered her by then. And then, when I remembered the rules, that I was supposed to ignore her, my heart started to thump fast. I lowered my flashlight to my waist, pretending I was looking at something on the wall to prevent her from seeing my beam bouncing up and down from the trembling hands. I remembered that I had to do a full sweep before leaving if she was here, and I was only done with one floor, so at the thought of this I cursed in my mind. "Hey, I'm sorry. I think I fell asleep in one of the offices and stayed after closing," she said, but I ignored her. I pretended to look around some more, but I knew I could only do it so long before she got suspicious, so I decided to test my luck and just went for the door. As soon as I was inches close to her, she just stepped aside and let me move along. I strode to the next office, but heard her following me right behind.
"Hey, can you please let me out? My children must be worried sick,"
she repeated. The next 15 minutes or so, she was breathing down my neck, constantly trying to grab my attention. As I entered one of the offices, she pointed to the corner opposite of where my beam was and said,
"Hey, what's over there?"
I fought the urge to look there, knowing she was lying, but half scared that someone would just jump me right around the corner. As I progressed with my sweep, she became increasingly irritated, throwing stuff in my direction. Not at me, mind you, but trying to startle me by throwing them in front of my face, etc. Suddenly jumping in my walking path with a loud scream before moving aside again, clasping her hands over her mouth, and pointing behind me with wide eyes, which screamed utter fear, even saying things like,
"I know you can see me. I know you know I'm here. I can see how scared you are."
I ignored all her provocations as much as I could, and by the time I was back on the first floor, more than ready to get out, she was saying things like,
"Are you sure you checked all the rooms?"
giggling along the way. I put the key in the keyhole and everything went quiet. I didn't wait to see if she was gone, but instead just went out as calmly as I could and locked the door behind me. I couldn't sleep for a few weeks after that. A few months ago, I was stationed in an office building. At first it seemed like a common job, but I knew there was a catch before I even signed up. Sure enough, I was right. My partner and I were stationed on floor 43, which was undergoing renovations. Our job was to simply stand in the front of a door. The door had a card reader, and we were given access, but were strictly forbidden from entering. People in hazmat suits would be coming in and out all day long, from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. We were to let them in and out as they pleased, keeping track of the number of people who came and went. Now the catch was, after 4 p.m., we were ordered not to let anyone in or out. That meant even if someone knocked on the door at 4:01, we were to ignore them entirely. There would always be at least 3 people who'd try to leave the room after 4, always asking politely, and then becoming increasingly desperate, saying they simply lost track of time and pleaded with us, saying that their family was waiting for them at home. We always ignored their crying and pleading, no matter how desperate it was, until it turned into whimpers, and then finally stopped. Now I've only seen the room from the door, and what I could see, it was just a normal room undergoing renovation for the rest of the floor. So whatever was in there must have been deeper inside, or hidden in plain sight. As for the numbers we tracked, the number of people who would go out by the end of the day was always lower than the number of people who went in. One story a guard named Chris told me was about this time in an old mansion guarding a big mirror. He and his coworker were in the security room, patrolling every hour, especially making sure that the mirror was covered with the sheet. They were to, under no circumstances, look at the mirror. They had a camera feed of the mirror, which was on the bottom floor under the stairs, but it was turned so that the reflective side faced away from the camera. This one night, Chris's coworker goes for a patrol, and as he enters the mirror room, suddenly the sheet just slides off. Now the guy who told me this said it was technically impossible for the sheet to just come off, because it was fastened tightly. But somehow it did, and his partner just finds himself staring at the mirror. Chris locks the security room, as per the instructions from HQ, and calls the intervention team. Meanwhile, he glances back at the camera feed, only to find his coworker just staring blankly in the mirror. He thought the camera was frozen, but the timer was moving, so his partner was just very still. He tried radioing him, but there was no response. After about a minute or so, all of a sudden his partner pulls out a gun, puts it in his mouth, and blows his brains out. Chris was transferred the next day since a special team was sent to secure the mirror, and his services were no longer needed. One position that everyone is massively trying to apply for is a surveillance office in a small town close to my own. Why they want the position is what I'll get to in a bit. So basically, the camera feed on the monitors in HQ over there cover various private households. One of the households is said to have a man in a suit show up at the doorstep from time to time. Now usually, guards need to go out on the address to make sure everything is okay or apprehend the intruder. But for this specific individual, HQ left a very unique guide. Here are the instructions left by HQ. If the security official notices an individual in business attire on camera 12 during his shift, the steps below must be followed when confronting the individual. Step number 1. Approach the individual and wait for him to turn around. He will continue to smile for the entirety of the conversation, but should his expression change, disengage and run to safety as quickly as possible. Be advised that while firearms are not prohibited, they are highly ineffective against the individual. Do not turn or look away from the individual once he has turned around, unless you need to evacuate. Step number 2. The individual will, after turning around, inquire, "Lovely night, isn't it?" If the individual has not asked this question, follow the previous step and evacuate. Step number 3. If the individual has inquired the aforementioned question, respond with, "Yes it is, what can I do for you?" Or, "Indeed it is, how can I help you?" A combination of both works as well. If the individual ceases to smile during this interaction, proceed to evacuate immediately. Step number 4. If done correctly, the individual will now ask, "Can you sing me a song?" If he says anything else, evacuate. Step number 5. From here, you are to sing the pre-taught song to the individual while ignoring his taunts and distractions. If so much as one word, pause, tone, or stress are missed, evacuate. If the individual stops smiling during the song, evacuate. Step number 6. If done correctly, the individual will say, "Splendid, thank you for the beautiful song." If he says anything else aside from that, evacuate. Step number 7. If step 6 was done correctly, close your eyes for at least 10 seconds and then open them. On the front steps where the individual stood will now be a briefcase containing a large sum of money, while the individual himself will be gone and the household safe. Step number 8. On the way back, the security official may encounter people of various ages in dire need of help. Most common occurrences include starving women and newborn babies, lost children, an attractive young woman hitchhiking, etc. They are to be ignored and not offered assistance under any circumstances. Step number 9. Return to post and turn off camera 12. Note: the company does not claim the reward from the individual. Therefore, the security official is free to keep it. The high-risk, high-reward position makes it attractive to many people, but most of them never live to tell the tale. I was also told that the candidates go through rigorous training, focusing primarily on sprinting. The candidates also need to pass the test, which simulates the encounter with the businessman no less than 5 times with 95% or higher score. They are forced to remember the song perfectly, going through a computerized scanner which detects any notes which were off. I don't know what the song is, but I was told it's a simple tune which sounds like something taught in preschool. Anyway, this is as far as I'll go on this post, but I have some more stories to share in my future updates. In the meantime, stay safe and try to stay away from these kinds of things. They sound attractive due to pay or a rush some people thrive on, but a tiny mistake can cost you your life, or worse. Here are some more stories about places that I was stationed at, and the ones I heard from other guards in the company. A lot of these guards are dead now, and I reckon the same could happen to me at any moment on my shift. So in case there's a lack of updates, most likely something happened to me. So one memorable experience I have had, and not in a good way, was when I was stationed at a local park with another guard. The park wasn't too big, had a playground, running track which wound in a circle around the park itself, and a tennis court. Everything else around were thick trees, so following the running track gave me a very convincing impression of being in a forest, away from civilization. My coworker and I were starting our shift in the park at 7 p.m. and would end it at 7 a.m. There was a tiny guardhouse near the entrance which we would spend most of our shift in, and every 2 hours we would go patrolling around the park, very strictly following the running track where the path was illuminated. We were given a heavy-duty flashlight and a backup torch in case the main one runs out of power. HQ issued an order that if we found any burnt-out light on our path, we were to retreat to the guardhouse immediately and let maintenance know about it in the morning. Under no circumstances were we to step into the dark patch of the track. This one night, I was doing my rounds around the park when all of a sudden I hear my partner's voice. He simply shouted, "Hey, help me!" from a distance. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, so I called out to him, moving my beam across the trees beyond the path. Now, the light we were given is able to penetrate darkness so well that you could see at least 100 meters in front of you. But when I illuminated the area my partner's voice was coming from, there was nothing. Moreover, the voice seemed to change the positions it was coming from. He yelled again, "Hey, help me!" I called him once more, asking him to tell me where he was, but there was no response. I didn't dare wander into the darkness, especially with no signs of him anywhere, heavy-duty light or not. Then, my partner yelled for help again, and I realized something which made the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight. His cries for help were on a loop, always saying the same thing, same intonation, same length of pauses. I even looked at my watch, and sure enough, I was right. Call for help, 8-second pause. Call for help, 8-second pause. I then realized how suddenly quiet everything was. Usually the park was somewhat loud at night, crickets, owls, etc. Now it was so silent I could hear my own heart thumping. I turned around very slowly and walked out of there, doing my best not to sprint as my partner's looping cries for help persisted almost halfway until I was back at the guardhouse. When I finally got back, my suspicion was confirmed and my partner was there, visibly confused at what I had just told him. We called HQ to report suspicious activity, and in no less than 5 minutes, a vehicle pulled up at the entrance. An intervention unit emerged, which was essentially an armored and heavily armed team sent in case of emergencies. I was questioned by the team leader for the next hour, while the others went to the scene where I had heard the voice of my coworker. My partner and I were escorted out of the place, and the next following morning, we were told that the park contract was voided by the company, and we no longer needed to go there. I don't know anything else though, because right after that I returned to my original post back at HQ. I spoke to a former intervention unit member who had worked for the company for over 5 years. He said that some of the shit he had seen was unimaginable and he was willing to share some with me. For instance, this one time they got a call from a residential building they were securing that there were strange noises coming from one of the rooms. The team arrived on the scene and questioned the guard who reported the incident. Apparently, his job was to make sure no one entered room 416. He explained that the room itself was unoccupied, but that noises would be heard constantly between 2 and 3 a.m. Usually, these noises would include childlike giggling, loud footsteps, bouncing of something on the floor, etc. The residents learned to ignore the noises, but this one old lady, Mrs. Rogers, managed to get in, which he saw in the camera feed. Now, the intervention unit was told not to go in after anyone after 20 minutes had passed, but they still had time, so they rushed to the room. The guy who was telling me this said that as they approached the room, they heard voices, like a group of people trying to talk in a hushed tone. He explained that it sounded like kids in school when they were trying to whisper, but were unintentionally loud enough for others to hear. As soon as they touched the doorknob, the voices stopped in unison. Not like the conversation was over, like literally as if someone pressed a mute button in the middle of a sentence. They burst inside the empty room, which looked like no one stepped inside for years, weapons raised. No one was there, and as they were standing there, completely silent, they hear a barely audible, wheezing sound from above. They all look up, and as they do, they freeze. The guy who told me this said that when he saw what he saw still keeps him up at night sometimes. Mrs. Rogers was standing on the ceiling like a spider on all fours, craning her head so much they thought her neck was broken. And she was looking directly at the unit upside down, wide-eyed. Spit was occasionally dropping from her mouth to the floor as she was wheezing. Her fingers had somehow mutated into long claws. Then, without any warning, Mrs. Rogers had managed to jump down on one of the team members in the blink of an eye, and gunshots ensued. He said by the time they were done shooting, 2 more members were down, and Mrs. Rogers had hundreds of bullet holes in her body and head, and was no longer moving. He encountered similar scenarios after that, but never came close to dying again. The building residents were evacuated from the building indefinitely the next day, and the official story given was that there was toxic fungi located within the building. The final story I'll share here is going to be one that was told by another guard who went missing later on. He was stationed at a private school, and it had a set of very strict rules they had to follow. First off, there were 10 guards in total in each shift, and each team were assigned to a classroom. Their job was to count all the students after the classes were over. Should any of the students go missing, they were to call HQ immediately. Now comes the weird part. One day, the guard who told me this story counts all of the kids in class, and the final number doesn't add up. Instead of 32 students, he has 33. He counts a few times to make sure, and when the number is confirmed as 33, he tells the teachers to start calling on them by name and separating them from the group one by one. The teacher does so, calling each and every student, but when they're done, there are no surpluses. The list showed 32, and 32 were called on, and yet 33 students were in the classroom. They couldn't tell who the extra student was, even when the guard was watching them like a hawk to make sure none of them would sneak into the group of the called-on kids while they weren't looking. Baffled and unsure what to do, the guys tell the teacher to keep an eye on them while he contacts HQ. Already feeling silly for contacting the higher-ups over an extra student rather than a missing one, he expected HQ to scold him for calling about something like that, but when he says he has an extra student who just popped up, chuckling at the absurdity of the situation, the person on the other end of the line suddenly goes silent. She asks him to repeat what he said, and when he does, the woman tells him to get the teacher out of there, lock the classroom immediately, and radio everyone else to do the same at once. He does so, and only minutes later the intervention unit arrives, escorting the guards out of there. He said he had no idea what happened next, but when he returned to the school the next day for his shift, everything seemed to be normal. No one really knows what the company is dealing with here. Not even intervention was told what these encounters are, since it seems to be a very strict need-to-know basis. One thing's for sure though, when I hear some of these stories from other guards, I realize how lucky I got to run into some of these creatures and live to tell the tale. I want to start off by clarifying one thing before I start. The company I work for is not the SCP. I know there are a lot of similarities between the encounters which I described and some of the SCP files, but my company has nothing to do with that. We are, just as I stated before, a standalone security company that provides technical security, surveillance, and physical protection services to clients. I'm going to start this post with a story that still runs chills down my spine. While I was stationed at an office complex similar to the one in HQ where I am now, I had a number of strange experiences. Our job was mostly staying in the guardhouse and conducting mandatory patrols around the complex, at the start and at the end of the shift, him taking one side while I took the other. A few months back, I came to my shift as usual with my partner. So on that day, we finished our initial patrol and returned to the guardhouse. We usually talk to pass the time, but this time he seemed unapproachable and quiet, so I figured I should leave him alone and continued reading my book for the time being. Our shift was almost over when we decided to do our final sweep, so we split up to do our rounds. After I was done, I came back, but my partner wasn't there. I figured he wasn't done with his sweep yet, so I shrugged it off and continued passing the time. When he wasn't back in over 30 minutes though, I radioed him. No response. He was nowhere on the cameras either. Figuring he may be in trouble, I went out to search for him, frustrated that he wasn't back and it was almost the end of our shift. As I'm patrolling, I see him in the distance across the parking lot, turned away from me and looking at something. I called out his name and he turned around. I waved to him, telling him to get back, and he waved back to me. I took it as a signal that he understood what I said and returned to the guardhouse. The guys from the next shift were already there and I went home, telling them my partner would do the debriefing. Not 2 hours later, I got a phone call from the same guys. They told me my partner never showed up, so they went looking for him, thinking something may have been wrong. Sure enough, soon after they started the search, he was found dead. I was shocked to say the least. I asked them when he had died and how, since I had seen him literally minutes before they arrived. They told me that it wasn't possible for me to have seen him then. I asked why, and the answer they gave me chilled me to the bone. Apparently, he died about 10 hours ago. The camera recordings confirmed it. He was seen wandering off camera into the garage and then never seen coming out. One of the guys discovered his body there, no visible wounds or marks on him. HQ recovered his body, but shared no details about the cause of his death. So that begs the question, if he died 10 hours ago, who the fuck did I see in the parking lot? And moreover, who in the fuck's name was with me in the guardhouse for 10 hours between patrols? In that same place, in addition to our patrol around the complex, we also had to check inside buildings and make sure everything was alright. So one time on my shift, I'm in one of the office buildings doing my sweep on the second floor, and I move to the stairs to get to the next floor. I climb up, and as I do, I see that the sign on the wall says second floor again. I dismiss it, thinking I must have been on the first floor prior to this and just got confused. I moved up one floor, and again, the sign says second floor. I stare at the sign in bafflement and decided to try the door. Locked. I climb up one more floor, and again, I'm on the second floor. I knew by this point something was wrong. I mean, the building itself has only 3 floors, and I had already climbed at least 4. I decided to descend the stairs as fast as I could, but every time I passed by the floor sign, it said second floor. I ran until I was exhausted, trying doors along the way, all of which were locked. I leaned over the railing to look down the stairs and saw the staircase going down infinitely into black abyss. Same for above. I radioed my partner, but there was no response. No signal on the phone either. I decided to sit down and think about everything, already half accepting my impending demise. It must have been hours there that I sat and ran down the stairs intermittently when I suddenly heard the sound of a door opening below. I was so relieved to actually hear someone besides my own footsteps that I didn't even think about the potential dangers it might entail. I rushed down and to my relief, saw the sign floor for floor 1. The door opened as I had left it when I entered the building. I bolted out of there and straight to the guardhouse, barging in through the door. My coworker was reading the newspaper, only shooting a glance at me before returning to his reading. When I accused him for not answering his radio, he looked confused, stating he never got a call from me. I asked him why he hadn't looked for me when I hadn't returned in hours, and again, he looked confused. He glanced at his watch and then at me, and simply said, "You've been gone for 5 minutes." HQ issued a rule after that. The office building was off limits for all personnel after 8 p.m. One time during my shift, as I was finishing my patrol, I heard my coworker's voice in the distance. He sounded like he was in distress, so I followed the sound, calling out his name. As I approached the source of the voice, it became obvious that my coworker was in the looping building, begging me to help him. I drew my gun and told him to hold on, ready to risk my life for my partner, and just as I was about to enter, I heard his voice behind me, calling my name. I turned around and sure enough, there he was. I looked back at the building and the cries from the person in the building stopped completely. The coworker confirmed it wasn't him who was in the building, and as I turned back to the source of the voice, I could only mutter to myself, You sneaky son of a bitch. One thing that happened to one of the guys during one of the shifts still puts me on edge. The guy named Chris was in the guardhouse with his partner, and the partner decided to go for a patrol earlier. Chris continued reading his books as the partner left the place. 1 minute later, he heard the door shut behind him and the thud of his footsteps of his partner inside. "Forget something, huh?" he asked, not looking up from his book. The partner put his hand on Chris's shoulder, and Chris raises his head, ready to turn around. And as he does, he sees his coworker pass next to the window outside. Chris froze, staring at the window, at the reflection of the figure standing behind him. He says he felt the grip on his shoulder tightening. Bracing himself as well as he could, he swiftly turned around, drawing his gun and pointing it at nothing. No one was there. I checked the recordings of the camera feed in the guardhouse, and sure enough, no one was there with him. I could see Chris on the camera sitting up, visibly becoming tense and turning around with his gun drawn, before looking around and finally holstering the weapon. He looked like a crazy person from this angle. I never figured what that was, or the other occurrences in the complex. But HQ issued new orders shortly after. The guards who were on the shift were to stay together at all times, even patrolling in pairs, and communicating via code sentences every 30 minutes to ensure their partner wasn't an imposter. Chris told me of another incident he had during one of his shifts. He said that he saw someone suspicious on camera in front of one of the offices way after working hours. So he went to investigate. Halfway through, the partner radioed him and said he lost the person out of sight. It was strange though, because apparently he only turned around for 1 second and the guy on camera was gone. However, he said he thought he noticed movement on the camera which overlooked the windows of the office from the outside. He said it was on the 2nd floor. Chris decided to investigate it. As he's doing his sweep on the 2nd floor, his partner radios him again halfway into his patrol and asks him if he found anyone. Chris says no, asking him if he sees anything on camera. The partner first says no, and then he pauses mid-sentence. Chris asks him to confirm what he said, and the partner tells Chris he should come back to the guardhouse. Chris wanted to finish the sweep, but the partner insisted he come back to the guardhouse at once. Frustrated, he returned and asked him what was wrong. "You really didn't see anyone in there?" the partner asked. When Chris said no, the partner called him over to look at one of the camera feeds. He rewinds the footage to where he can see Chris in the window with the flashlight and tells him to pay close attention. Chris wasn't alone there. When his beam flashed across the window, it caught a silhouette staring at the camera. The next few seconds of the recording were spent by him talking to his partner on the radio, and in addition to the window silhouette, there was now a person standing directly behind him. As Chris moved through the room, more and more people became visible in the room, all staring directly at him, while he was completely oblivious to their presence. After that, he saw himself exiting the building, while the people in the building were disappearing, or more like blending in with the darkness. Overall, I've worked in various fucked up places, but this one seems to be the most dangerous and aggressive one, with even HQ not being able to predict some of the things. There are more stories to share, but I'll post them another time. If any of you know of anyone who has similar experiences to mine as a security guard, chances are we work for the same company. I know a lot of you guys have been eager to see an update, but I've been too busy with work to update more frequently. I'll try to update more often. Anyway, here I am with some more stories from my company. The first story I'm going to tell you is about a big office building our company has a contract with. I never personally worked there, but some of the guys I know did. One of the guards told me about the place in more detail. Apparently, it's a normal office building where people work a regular 9-to-5 job, but our guards need to be there 24/7, from around 8 a.m. until 6 p.m. until all employees leave. It's pretty leisure. However, the guards and the employees have one strict rule to follow. The building has no doors, including the one at the entrance. So at first glance, it looks really strange to see all these offices, bathrooms, etc., with naked door frames. After the employees leave, guards are to conduct patrols every hour until the end of the shift. They have to make sure all the door frames have no doors on them, and should they spot an actual door anywhere on the premises, they are to make sure it isn't closed. If the door was open, or at least left slightly ajar, the guards would need to put one of those door holders on the ground to prevent the door from closing. The guards would carry a bunch of door holders on patrols just for this purpose. If the door was closed, however, they were ordered not to go near it under any circumstances. They also had a map of the building and had to memorize where each room was, making sure that the layout of the rooms was exactly how it was on the map, including the direction the office desks and furniture were facing, etc. Now, the guard who told me this shared his own experience with me. He said that everything was calm for the first few months, and then during one of his night shift patrols, he ran into a door on the second floor which was slightly ajar. He could see an office space behind the door, and following the instructions, he pulled out his door holder and went to put it in front of the door. However, as he did so, he apparently stumbled forward and actually pushed the door, which shut with a loud click. He swears he couldn't have just fallen like that, so he firmly believes something or someone somehow made him fall. When he saw that he accidentally shut the door, the guy panicked and decided to push everything under the rug by quickly opening the door, hoping no one would notice. But he says that when he opened it, that office was no longer there. He was instead looking at the bathroom. He thought he was in the wrong place at first, because there was no way the bathroom would be there. So when he double-checked, sure enough he was right. The office space he initially saw was supposed to be there, so he closed the door and opened it again. This time, he was staring at the kitchen. Fascinated by the whole thing, he kept closing and opening the door over and over, seeing all the different rooms from the building. He said he would have gone on some more, but his partner radioed him to ask how far he was in his sweep. The guy ended up closing and opening the door for a few more minutes until he finally saw that same office again. He placed the door holder on the floor and bolted back to the security room. He reported the appearance of the door to HQ, leaving out the details about closing and opening it. Everything was fine that night, but the following morning he was called by his boss, who asked him what the fuck he was thinking closing the door like that. The guard was confused about how his boss knew. The boss told him that apparently some of the rooms had shifted around and now the entire office building was completely jumbled up. No one was harmed, and nothing really happened other than that, save for the only other inconvenience being the workers having to make their way from the third floor all the way to the ground floor to use the bathrooms. He continued working there, but never saw another door again. One specific story which stands out for me is from a guard who was stationed as security in a residential house between 9 p.m. and 4 a.m. The owners, a married couple, lived there, and they would leave the house every night at 8 p.m., and the guard who was appointed was told by the owners that the duties were fairly simple. HQ briefed the guard before he started working by giving him a list of rules to follow. Here's the transcript of the written rules. Duty starts at 9 p.m. However, make sure to be there at least 1 hour earlier. Before leaving your home for duty, take a sharp object and leave it inside your home near the exit, for instance, on the shoe stand. Any sharp object will do. However, the sharper the better, preferably something that can easily puncture skin. If you can't make it at least 30 minutes before 9 p.m. to the house where you perform your duty, inform HQ and skip your shift. Do not attempt to enter the house at or after 9 p.m. under any circumstances. Once inside and owners leave, follow these rules carefully. 9 to 10 p.m. You can move freely throughout the house, with the exception of entering the basement. 10 p.m. to 11 p.m. Stay in the living room during the entire hour. Do not leave the room under any circumstances. Do not leave the house either. If you need to use a bathroom, use a bottle or any other means. 11 p.m. to 11:23 p.m. You will hear someone knocking on the window. Avoid looking at it. The knocking may become relentless and loud, but do not look at it. You may turn on the TV for distraction. 11:23 p.m. to midnight. The knocking may have stopped by now, but you now may hear children crying upstairs. Ignore it. No children reside in the house. Midnight to 0:25 a.m. You may move freely around the first floor of the house, although it is advised you stay in the living room, kitchen area, and prepare for your next step. 0:25 to 0:30 a.m. Below the sink in the kitchen is a bucket full of fresh meat. Take it to the basement. You do not need to enter the basement. You can simply leave the bucket near the door inside. But make sure to close and lock the door again. A very important thing to note here. Make sure you do not spill or drop any blood or meat from the bucket on the floor anywhere outside the basement, since it can accurately smell blood up to a mile away. If you happen to spill any blood, do not bother cleaning. Simply follow the next step. 0:30 a.m. to 1 a.m. You may hear growling noises coming from the basement. Do not bother investigating. If you have previously spilled any blood around the house, do not bother cleaning up and instead sit on the couch. Turn on the TV and turn up the volume to the max. Clasp your ears with your hands and keep your eyes firmly shut. Face the ground and stay in this position until 1 a.m. If there is a pause on the TV for more than a few seconds, try to produce any loud sound of your own by screaming or speaking loudly to drown out any unnatural noises you may hear. 1 a.m. to 2 a.m. You may freely move throughout the entire house again, basement excluded. This is a time to use for bathroom breaks. Do not attempt to leave the house. You should also use this time to memorize the room layouts, furniture especially. During this hour, you may hear a voice coming from the bedroom of the second floor. If you do, investigate. If there is a man in the room, lock the door and return to the living room immediately. Do not attempt to talk to the man. If the room is empty, you may continue to move freely. 2 a.m. to 3:33 a.m. Nothing major will happen during this hour. Ignore any ringing of the phone. Do not pick it up no matter how much it rings. 3:33 a.m. to 3:55 a.m. Now is the time to take stock of all the furniture in the house. If you see any extra furnishing, do not sit on it or touch it in any way. You will start to feel extremely sleepy by this point. Whatever you do, you must not fall asleep. It is recommended you spend this time in the kitchen and leave the sink water running so you can splash your face whenever your eyelids become too heavy. 3:55 a.m. to 4 a.m. The owners will have returned by now. Before leaving, make sure to say aloud the sentence, "My duty is finished." Note that if you do not do it, upon entering your home, you'll find that you are back in the house of the owners. Should this be the case, then you only have one option. Take the sharp object you left close to the door and inflict mild damage to yourself. Minor stab in the forearm or hand, etc. If the house doesn't change to your own home, repeat the previous step until it does. He just quit after one night. The last story I'll share today is about a place I was supposed to work in, but luckily said no. This was apparently a big lodge, deep inside a forest, and HQ had a ton of people waiting in line to work there. There were no duties there, no guarding, no paranormal rules, nothing. So when I asked what's the catch, they said the guards can never leave the place until another one takes over. When I laughed, the chief stared at me. He went on to explain that there have been cases of people wanting to quit in the middle of their shift, but whenever they do, something happens which prevents them from leaving. Either a huge storm, an accident, injury, suddenly coming down with a fever severe enough to stop them from moving, etc. One guy even tried calling his friends to pick him up, but the friend ended up getting lost in the woods. Another guy tried leaving despite the thick snowstorm, but as he trekked through the snow, he ended up right back at the house. He claims there was no way he could have been back there, since he only went straight, and yet there he was. HQ has all these guards in line ready to take over, in case someone fails to show up for their shift, and the guard who was previously there is stranded. They still don't know how the lodge works or why anyone has to be there, but all they do know is that one person always has to be there. The even stranger thing, no one in HQ knows how and when they signed a contract for this place. Whoever the client is, he is sending payments to the company every month and it is impossible to track down. Well, that's it for now. I'll update you guys again in a few days, since there's been a bunch more stories to share. One of the guards told me that he worked in a residential building. The building itself was normal, but in the basement of the building was a big round hole. No one knew how it got there, and the residents said they just woke up to find it there one day. The old lady who discovered it almost fell inside when she went to retrieve her bicycle. Various survey and research teams were sent to investigate the hole, but oddly enough, no equipment could determine where the bottom was. Electronics would stop working at a certain depth. Throwing something inside produced no sound of impact. Chemical lights got swallowed by the darkness, etc. They sent one crew member down there, but after about 10 minutes of descending, he stopped responding. They pulled him out as fast as they could, but he was gone. All that was left of him was the pile of clothes he was wearing, still attached to the safety gear and ropes. The company was appointed to stand guard in front of the basement and not let anyone in. The guard who worked there, Andy, told me the job was pretty leisure most nights, except that he was bored. Then one night, he heard something coming from inside the basement. It sounded like someone was calling his name. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but the more he listened, the more he became convinced it was his sister. Despite getting instructions from HQ not to go near the hole, mostly due to the possibility of slipping and falling, Andy opened the door. Sure enough, there it was, his sister's voice calling him, right from the hole, clear as day. He asked her how she got there and if she was okay, and she perkily said that everything was fine. She asked Andy to come down there so they could talk. She talked in such a nonchalant way that Andy became suspicious of the whole situation. She asked him again to come down. Andy refused, telling her that he would call for help, to which his sister became increasingly agitated and angry. She demanded that he come down there and help her. Andy didn't budge, and his sister said that he would let her die down there, just like he let their father die. Andy froze to this, and his sister uttered a single sentence which made Andy run out of there.
Andy, life is nothing but a pile of shit.
Those were his father's last words before he killed himself in front of Andy. Andy bolted out of the building, listening to his sister calling after him and begging him to come down. Andy called HQ, telling them he was never going back. He was assigned to a different post and never had a problem again. The really weird thing about this whole experience was that no one but Andy knew what his father's last words were. He never told anyone that he watched him turn the gun on himself, and just stuck to the story that he found him dead. But the weirdest thing of all was the fact that his sister had died in a tragic car accident 4 years before he ever saw the hole. The basement was locked tightly afterwards, and guards continued working there, but they all reported the same thing. Voices of their loved ones calling them from the hole, and always asking one thing, same thing, to come down. The intervention guy whose story I shared in one of the earlier updates told me another one recently, which chilled me to the bone. He and his unit were stationed at a long-since abandoned hotel. They'd get to do whatever they wanted in the hotel, but at exactly 4:25 a.m., they had to assemble at the reception desk. Their job was to sweep the entire area for any suspicious activity. The guy who told me this said HQ never told them who or what they were looking for, but they were ordered to shoot on sight upon seeing anyone besides the unit members in the hotel. They had been sweeping the hotel 4 nights in a row at exactly 4:30 a.m. until 5 a.m., but never found traces of anyone. And then on the 5th night, as they checked the 2nd floor, the commander of the unit ordered them to stop and be quiet. There was a sound of muffled giggling coming from somewhere on the floor. Strangely though, as they listened, the giggling was always the same intonation and length of pause. Giggle, 5-second pause. Giggle, 5-second pause. He described it as an adult trying to impersonate a child's giggle. Carefully, the unit followed the sound to one of the rooms, and as they stood in front of the door, the giggling became louder and more frequent. The unit burst inside the room and pointed their guns at the source of the sound. Facing the window was a tall person, except it wasn't a person. Here's how the guy who told me this described the creature. A very round face, which contrasted its impossibly thin body. It had extremely long arms and legs, and it was so inhumanly tall that it had to hunch over and bend its knees in order to avoid touching the ceiling. It giggled again, and it still sounded muffled, just as it did behind a closed door. The unit stood there with their guns pointed at this thing, as the creature giggled once more before going silent. and then it slowly started to turn around and locked eyes with the unit. The creature apparently had a grinning, toothy, round face with large, unblinking eyes, and this took the unit aback so much that they froze. It giggled again, but this time it was deeper and more guttural, albeit still muffled. Just then, the creature started running towards the unit, all while giggling, louder and faster than ever. Everyone fired at will, practically emptying their clips into the thing. Luckily, the giggler, as he was later dubbed by the intervention unit, never managed to reach them and fell backwards as soon as the force of the bullets connected with it. As it lay there on the ground, it apparently kept giggling some more, but the sound became slower and more quiet, until it completely stopped, leaving the creature dead with its grinning face never changing. The commander informed HQ about this, who told them that their mission was complete and they no longer needed to stay in the hotel. The intervention guy concluded that 2 of the unit members committed suicide within 2 months after the mission. In their farewell notes, they said they could no longer stand to listen to the giggling at night. Recently, I was transferred to the operator's room in HQ. Essentially, I'd sit in a room with a lady who served as backup for various guards who found themselves in situations they couldn't resolve. Most of the situations were your run-of-the-mill cases, where guards had drunks trespassing, or being unsure if they should investigate certain sounds, etc. There was only one call that I witnessed which stood out for me. It was a late night, and we got a call from a guard who was stationed at a private farm. Whenever a call came through, I'd put on the extra pair of headsets, which would allow me to hear the conversation. Here's the transcript of the conversation. Operator:
This is HQ. What's your situation?
Guard: Yeah, this is Mark from Spencer Farm. There's a guy standing in front of the barn. I can see him on the camera.
Alright.
He's been standing here for 2 hours now. At first I thought the camera was frozen, but when I zoomed in just now, I could see his fingers are moving. He's tapping them nervously on his thigh. And wait, his head seems to be twitching slightly.
Is he armed?
I can't see from here. He's facing away from the camera, but I don't see anything in his hands.
He's standing on private property. You need to warn him to leave right away.
Yeah, I'll do that right away.
Stay on the call while you do so and tell me if you need backup.
5 minutes later, we heard the guard's voice over the call again. Sir, can you hear me? There was a moment of silence.
What's going on over there?
He isn't responding. He's just standing and twitching there. His twitching is getting more and more violent. I think something's wrong with him.
Get him off the property.
Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to... There was a loud scream coming from the guard. The operator pressed him to respond with what was wrong, but the guard kept screaming and panting on the line, followed by the sound of frantic footsteps. There was a sound of a door violently shutting and shuffling, before the guard quieted down and tried to calm his breathing as much as he could.
Mark, I need you to talk to me. What's going on?
The guard's voice came through in a whisper.
Can't talk. He's right outside.
By this point, I had already called the intervention unit, who said they would arrive on the scene in 10 minutes.
Mark, can you get somewhere safe? Backup will be there in 10 minutes, but I need you to hide. Can you do that?
I'm inside the locker.
He's standing just outside the security room. There's something wrong with his face. What do you mean? It's all wrong. It's like, it's sideways. His head is normal and all, but the eyes, nose, and mouth are all flipped sideways. I think he's calling my name. Oh God, he's coming inside. There was a sound of a door slowly opening, and then a set of slow and deliberate footsteps. Mark's breathing became stifled as he tried to steady it, probably clasping a hand over his mouth. And then a voice came through, a raspy voice, which sounded as if the person on the other end had something stuck in their throat. Mark,
it said. Mark's breathing suddenly became more violent, and then he started screaming and begging for his life. The call ended, and the operator and I stared at each other in disbelief. The intervention team arrived on the scene soon. There was no trace of Mark or the man that attacked him. The camera feed showed Mark approaching the man, who then turned around to face the guard, and then Mark running back to the security room. From there, the man followed Mark to the security room, taking slow, unsteady steps, twitching along the way.
He opened the locker where Mark had hid himself. Then the camera feed cut out. On the frames where the man was facing the camera, I could see his face clearly. It was exactly as Mark had described it, as if the man's face was rotated to the left by 90 degrees. A pair of eyes staring blankly sideways on top of one another, and a mouth which looked like a smile, but was instead just a crooked slit. Mark was never found again. My next story is going to be from another intervention unit member. He was stationed at some experimental facility and didn't want to share any details about its location or nature of the experiment, because as he said, more than his job would be at stake. He spent about 5 months there with his unit and never saw any action. The regular security guards like me were taking care of the mundane problems like trespassers, etc. However, his unit regularly had drills in case of any emergency scenarios. He said the drills were not the typical military kind, but that there were some rules they needed to know, which pertained to not getting into any kind of physical contact with civilians. Their main objective in the worst case scenario was to seal off all exit points. Sure enough, one day an alarm sounds in the facility, and he and his team get ready to start their mission. As they made their way through the facility, they ran into various dead scientists and other staff members. And then they ran into a survivor, a researcher, all bloody and scared. He raised his hands and begged them not to shoot, while the unit just kept barking orders at him to keep his distance. The researcher kept saying that he's not infected, whatever that meant. And as he stood there, eyeing everyone, all of a sudden he snarled, showing rows of sharp teeth which were not there a second ago. And then he lunged forward, tackling one unit member and sinking his teeth into his face. The guy told me they started shooting long before he even lunged, but it was as if the researcher didn't even react to the bullets. He was riddled with holes and bled, but just kept biting and biting, until finally he just fell over. He tried to jump again, but died a second later. The unit members emptied their clips into the now dead scientist and proceeded to leave the facility, leaving their one dead team member behind. Once they secured the facility and locked every exit point, locking the potential survivors inside, they contacted HQ and a bunch of armored vehicles with military personnel and hazmat suits showed up. The unit was dismissed from the facility and warned not to talk about any sensitive details related to the experiment, names of staff members, etc. No matter how much I pressed him, he refused to tell me more. The final story in this post which I'm going to share is from a guard named Tom, who worked in an office building. Before he got sent to work, HQ gave him a 1-week training. He was strictly forbidden from talking or making any kind of vocal sounds while working in the office. Communication with his partner by talking was also forbidden too, so they used hand signals. Upon arriving on his first day, Tom saw people doing their everyday jobs at their desk, typing away, but never ever talking. They wouldn't even look at him, but would just instead stare at their screens all day. Tom followed HQ's instructions and conducted his duties, not talking to anyone. But one day, he brought his cell to work because he was bored. As he made his way through the office, someone started calling him, and the song, which was set as his caller tone, blared in the office. He quickly turned it off, but then realized something terrible. All eyes in the office were fixed on him. The people had stopped typing and working and just stared at Tom, with an expressionless face. Tom mumbled, "Shit," to himself, and everyone in the office unanimously said, "Shit," in a synchronized tone. Tom slowly made his way out, and as he went through the hall, he saw through the glass the people were still staring at him. Not only them though, but everyone else in the office stared at Tom as well. He locked himself in the security room along with the partner, and eventually the people returned to their normal taskless work. The next day, Tom was fired for bringing his phone to work and potentially putting himself and his partner in danger. He said it's a good thing too, because he was planning on quitting. This is Kinetic Symphony. If you've enjoyed this narrated story, please subscribe and like the video to help me grow. Thank you.